In this lesson, you're going to explore the basic volume of the rib cage by drawing from simplified versions of it. To do this, you're going to make two miniature rib cages. One you're going to make from an egg, and the other you're going to make from paper. These basic rib cage volumes will provide the foundation upon which you will construct the more complex forms of the figure in the future. But before I show you how to make your miniature rib cages, I'd like to introduce you to an important concept: compound curves. To understand what a compound curve is, let's first draw a curved line on a flat piece of paper. The line, of course, is curving, but the piece of paper remains flat. A compound curve occurs when the surface that a curved line is drawn upon also begins to curve. By bending this piece of paper, we have a curved line traveling over a curved surface. The thoracic arch of the rib cage is a compound curve. By drawing from the two miniature rib cage volumes that you're going to learn about today, you'll have a better understanding of the basic volumes of the rib cage as well as the complex compound curves of the thoracic arch. I'm going to begin by showing you how to turn a real egg into a simplified rib cage volume. To do this, you'll need an egg and a pencil. I would highly recommend using hard-boiled eggs for this project. You can also find wooden eggs at hardware stores. I would also recommend that you watch the preparation process all the way through at least once before attempting to prepare your own egg. The first thing you're going to do is find the very top of the egg, where you're going to draw a small dot. Now you want to make sure this dot is centered, so when you look down on the egg from directly above, the dot appears to be at the center. Next, you're going to do the same thing on the bottom of the egg. Find the very bottom and draw a small dot. It's important that these two dots are centered, so that if they were connected by an imaginary line, this line would run directly through the center of the egg. Next, starting with one dot, you're going to draw a line that travels all the way around the surface of the egg and connects back up with the dot from which you started the line. Although this line, of course, will curve over the surface of the egg as it travels from one dot to another, you'll notice that when the egg is viewed from directly above or directly from the side, this line appears straight. When you're drawing, if you're using graphite pencil, you may get graphite on your fingers and leave fingerprints or smudges on the surface of the egg. Luckily, graphite erases quite well from the surface of eggs, so at any point in this process, feel free to clean up the egg with an eraser. Next, at the very top of the egg, which will be the smaller, more narrow end of the egg, you're going to make two marks, one on either side of the dot that you placed at the center of the top of the egg. Both of these new marks will be on the line that you just drew. When doing this, you'll want to make one of these marks closer to the dot at the center of the top of the egg and the other a little further away. You can see that the mark I've drawn on the right side of the dot is a little closer to the center dot than the mark I've drawn on the left. Although the precise placement of these marks can vary slightly, you want to try your best to match as closely as you can the basic proportions and distances between the marks and shapes I'll be drawing on the egg. Now, I'm going to use these two new marks to establish the diameter of a circle. I'll draw this circle so that the two marks that I just drew establish the outermost edges of the circle at its widest points. And you'll notice that the line I've drawn bisects the circle, cutting it in half. Now, because one of the marks we drew was closer to the dot at the center of the top of the egg and one was a little further away, you'll notice that the circle is slightly off-centered. This circle represents the opening where the cylinder of the neck would connect with the rib cage. And the fact that it's off-centered will ensure that the front of the opening for the neck will be lower than the back, tilting this ellipse forward, just as you saw in the diagrams that we drew in the previous lesson. Now, on the location of the mark that was a little further away from the dot at the center of the top of the egg, you'll see me draw a small V shape, pointing down toward the bottom of the egg. This, of course, represents the suprasternal notch. This next part is optional, but sometimes I like to color in the opening for the neck. Now I'll view this rib cage egg directly from the front. Hopefully you remember from the diagrams in the previous lesson that the rib cage does not occupy the very bottom of the egg shape. So here, you'll see me make a mark just a little up from the bottom of the egg. Next, I'll divide the distance from this mark to the suprasternal notch in half. Hopefully, you already understand that this gives us the location of the xiphoid process. Now we're going to draw the thoracic arch. So starting at the location of the xiphoid process, I'm going to draw two lines, one on each side of the xiphoid process. These two lines should mirror one another. Each of them should start at the xiphoid process and travel diagonally outward and down. You'll notice that both of these lines are just slightly curved. Taken together, these two lines create a shape that is somewhere between an upside-down V or an upside-down U shape. Now before we go any further, we're going to draw a large circle on the bottom of the egg. To do this, we're going to need to view the bottom of the egg from directly above. Here, you should be able to see both the mark at the center of the very bottom of the egg as well as the mark for the bottom of the rib cage. Now on the line we see, we're going to draw a second mark. These two marks should each be the exact same distance from the dot at the center of the bottom of the egg. Once both dots are placed, go ahead and use them to create the diameter of a circle. This circle should be much larger than the circle that we drew for the opening of the neck. And when we view the bottom of the egg from directly above, this circle should appear to be perfectly centered, with a dot at the center of the bottom of the egg directly at the center of the circle. With the circle at the bottom of the ribcage in place, now let's get back to the thoracic arch. So you can see that as my slightly curving line for the thoracic arch approaches the circle that represents the bottom of the rib cage, the line for the thoracic arch begins to change direction and curves right into the circle that represents the bottom of the rib cage. And of course, the line for the thoracic arch on the other side needs to mirror this. The next thing you'll see me do is connect the back of the bottom of the rib cage to the spine. I'll do this by curving each line at either side of the spine upward, where it will connect and flow right into the line for the spine. The very last things you'll see me do are to draw in the xiphoid process using a V shape, as well as mark the location of the 7th cervical vertebrae using a tiny circle at the top of the line for the spine. This concludes the drawing portion for the preparation of our rib cage egg. Feel free to use an eraser to clean up any smudges, fingerprints, or any excess lines that may have been accidentally drawn. You can also erase any construction lines that were used to draw the actual rib cage, but that aren't part of the rib cage itself. These lines include the front of the circle at the bottom of the rib cage, as well as the line that continues down below the sternum and xiphoid process. It's important to remember that this is not a perfect representation of a rib cage. A real rib cage is wider side to side than it is front to back. However, drawing from the simplified volume is a great opportunity for you to better understand the basic volume of the rib cage, as well as some of the complex and compound curvatures that move over its surface, including the sternum, the spine, and the thoracic arch. Hopefully you can see what an excellent job this model does standing in for the more complex volume of the rib cage. For this next project, you'll need to locate the paper ribcage PDF included with this lesson in the course content section. Just like the preparation for the egg, you'll want to watch this demonstration all the way through before you attempt to build your own paper ribcage. You'll need to print this PDF on a standard sheet of 8.5 by 11 inch paper. I've printed mine on 8.5 by 11 inch cardstock, but regular paper will do just fine. The preparation for this paper ribcage model is simple. First, you'll carefully cut along the dotted line using either scissors or an X-Acto blade and a cutting mat. Once the shape is cut out, you'll overlap and align the tabs on either side, creating a cone shape. Tape these tabs together. I'm using archival artist's tape, but regular Scotch tape will work just fine. Next, we'll need to flatten the cone shape. Place 2 fingers in the small opening at the top and gently place a flat hand on top of the larger opening at the bottom, and gently roll the form back and forth, being careful not to crease or fold it. This will help flatten out the cone shape, making sure that the width from side to side is wider than the depth, just like a real rib cage. This paper rib cage model is great because unlike the egg, you can actually see into the opening for the neck. You can also clearly see how the opening for the neck as well as the bottom of the rib cage angle upward as they approach the spine. Also, this hollow flattened cone shape gives you a better sense of the compound curve of the opening for the thoracic arch. Obviously, because of its straight sides, this is not a perfect representation of a rib cage either, but just like the egg, this will provide some excellent practice drawing the simplified elements that we will find in an actual rib cage and how they relate to one another as the volume moves through space. Now, this last step is optional, but it can be helpful when you're trying to draw from your paper rib cage. You're going to essentially create a handle for your rib cage model using a dowel or even a pencil. I'm using a white pencil, so it will match the color of the rib cage. Place the pencil inside the paper rib cage, aligned with the tabs on the back, and go ahead and tape it. This will enable you to turn the rib cage in space and stabilize it while you're drawing it, while keeping your hands away from the rib cage itself so they don't obscure any part of it. Now, before we get to today's drawing demonstration, I'd like to remind you about the shapes and elements we'll be focusing on. First, of course, is the large egg shape of the form as a whole. And of course, you'll want to pay attention to its axis. The next simple shape is the ellipse at the top of the egg for the opening of the neck. You'll want to pay close attention to both its axis and its width to height relationship. You'll also want to pay close attention to the distance and directional relationship between the suprasternal notch and the xiphoid process. This will help you establish the line for the sternum. You'll also want to pay close attention to where the contours of the thoracic arch and the bottom of the rib cage meet the outside contour of the basic egg shape. You'll also want to find the corner where the thoracic arch meets the bottom of the rib cage. It's critical to remember that each of these points has a specific distance and directional relationship between them. For example, if we look at the two bottom corners of the thoracic arch, we get a sense of how far apart they are from one another, as well as the fact that the corner on our right is lower than the corner on our left. I find that one of the most useful measuring strategies is to triangulate between 3 points. Any 3 points will work. And of course, you can measure the distances and directions between any conceivable points on the egg. For a refresher on angle sighting, triangulation, and measurement, I would encourage you to revisit the Measuring and Proportion course in the original Art and Science of Drawing series. Now, let's get to our drawing demonstrations. Let's start with the paper rib cage. First, I'll select the position. One note about this paper rib cage is that it really only works to draw it from the front. Because of its straight sides, it doesn't offer a good representation of the spine. When you're drawing today, you don't need to follow the exact order that I'm using to draw the various elements. Remember, the order of operations is not as important as getting all of the elements into your drawing. But I'll start with the straight edge of the paper rib cage on our left, and I'll establish both the distance and direction between the left side of the ellipse at the opening for the neck and the location where the bottom of the rib cage meets the side of the rib cage. Next, I'll draw the ellipse at the opening for the neck. I'm paying particular attention to the width to height relationship of the ellipse as well as its axis. You'll notice that the side of the ellipse on our right is higher than the side of the ellipse on our left. Next, I'll establish the side of the ribcage on our right. Now, even though the sides of a real ribcage are curved, these straight line relationships between the sides of the ellipse at the top of the rib cage and the bottom corners at the sides of the rib cage are essential if we want to get the basic proportions of the rib cage correct. That's one of the things I love about this paper rib cage model. It forces us to focus on relationships that are easy to miss when we're drawing from an egg shape or a real rib cage. With these 4 outermost corners established, now I'll place the suprasternal notch. Notice that it's closer to the side on our right than it is to the side on our left. Next, I'll drop a line down for the sternum. Now, of course, on this paper ribcage model, the sternum appears straight. When you draw from the egg that you prepared, it will appear curved. How straight or curved a real sternum appears largely depends on the model. Next, I'll locate the xiphoid process. To do this, I'm paying close attention to both the distances and the exact direction between the xiphoid process and the bottom corners of the rib cage. It's only once I'm certain that all of the various points we've drawn so far are properly placed that I will begin to carefully craft the complex curves of the thoracic arch. Now, once again, it's critical that you understand that the edges of this paper rib cage do not represent a real rib cage. The real rib cage has curved sides. However, once you've accurately drawn the paper rib cage as you've observed it, it's easy to modify this form into something closer to a real rib cage by simply bowing out the sides. Now for your practice today, this last part is optional, but it can be good practice to visualize and then modify your drawing of the paper rib cage cone into the volume of an egg, with the sternum located on the curving longitude line. Now I'll demonstrate how to draw from the egg. The process is very similar to the one you just saw me demonstrate using the paper rib cage. First, you'll select the position you want to draw it from and then stabilize it with your free hand. We'll start off by establishing the basic shape of the egg. Now it's very possible that the egg you prepare will be a slightly different shape than mine, so you'll want to pay close attention to not only the axis that the egg is tilted at, but also its width to height relationship. With the basic shape established, I'll now draw the longitude line, paying particular attention to the distance between each side of the egg. For example, this longitude line is closer to the side of the egg on our left than it is to the side of the egg on our right. In fact, you can see that the distance between the longitude line and the side of the egg on our right is about twice as large as the distance from the longitude line to the side of the egg on our left. Again, you should always be looking for these kinds of relationships. With the longitude line properly placed, I'll now draw the ellipse for the opening of the neck, paying particular attention to both its axis and its width to height relationship. Here, the location of the suprasternal notch nearly takes care of itself, because it's found at the intersection between the bottom of the ellipse for the opening of the neck and the longitude line. Next, I'll locate the xiphoid process. Now, it's important to note that because the top of the egg is tilted towards us, the sternum begins to appear larger, which places the xiphoid process closer to the bottom of the egg than it would normally appear. Next, I'll begin to craft the thoracic arch. I'm paying particular attention to the angle between the xiphoid process and where the thoracic arch intersects with the outer contour of the egg. Now, even though the side of the thoracic arch on our left would eventually travel down and meet the circle that we drew for the bottom of the rib cage, we don't see this because of the way the egg is turned. This is a great example of how drawing from a rib cage made from an actual egg will help prepare you to locate and draw the volume of the rib cage of a real figure. Now I'll complete the thoracic arch, paying particular attention to how it curves and how it connects with the circle that represents the bottom of the rib cage. Now you'll remember that the sides of the paper rib cage were too straight to represent the actual sides of a rib cage, which are more rounded. But the sides of an actual rib cage are actually a little flatter than what we would find in most eggs. Now this is optional in your practice today, but to help correct for this, you'll see me slightly flatten out the sides of the egg. In future lessons, you'll derive the exact shape and proportions of the rib cage from actual figures. But for now, let's get you to your practice working with your paper model of a rib cage as well as the egg you've prepared. So for your practice today, I'm going to ask you to position and draw both your paper ribcage model as well as the egg you've prepared a minimum of 12 times. Make sure that for each drawing you do, the subject you're working with is in a different position. And just a reminder that the paper ribcage model should only be drawn from the front, but the egg you can position and draw from any angle, front or back. Feel free to fit as many drawings as you can on a single page. At the end of your practice, you should have a minimum of 24 drawings, 12 of the paper rib cage and 12 of the egg. But as always, if you're looking for more practice, feel free to double, triple, or even quadruple the number of times you're drawing each subject. If for any reason you don't have access to a printer with paper or eggs, I've included some PDFs of the egg that I've prepared for you to draw from. Well, good luck with your practice today, and I will see you back here for the next lesson when you're going to learn how to locate and draw the rib cage while observing real human figures.